Russia just can't seem to pull off a mechanized assault right now. It's been trying. After a summer spent trying to infiltrate small groups of troops into the vital logistical city of Pokrovsk, Russia has reverted to type and is attempting to send its armor to batter Ukraine's defenses, but Ukraine always sees it coming. And the result is more Russian tanks and armored vehicles burning on the battlefield. That's precisely what happened in the Dobropillia direction on October 16th. Ukraine set the perfect trap. A Russian battalion walked straight into a hell from which there was no escape. United 24 media reports that the Russian military has just tried and failed to launch a mechanized attack on the Dobropillia region. The attack was designed to take the small settlement of Shakhove, which has been a target for Putin throughout much of October. In fact, this latest mechanized assault followed another in which Russia finally unleashed some of the T-90M battle tanks it had in storage, only to see those tanks obliterated in an instant. Check out our video if you'd like to learn more about that failed assault. This time around, Russia thought it was going to learn from its mistakes. It intended to take Shakhove, with that settlement then to serve as a launching pad into Dobropillia, which would itself enable an assault on Pokrovsk. The problem is the same one that Russia has faced with all of its mechanized assaults in recent memory. Ukraine was ready, and Russia's tanks and armored vehicles were obliterated. The news of the failed Russian assault comes from the infamous Azov National Guard, which Ukraine deployed to the Pokrovsk region in August to help counter a series of settlement snatches conducted by the Russian occupying forces. Since August, Azov has been working both to take territory back and to protect settlements that Putin's forces are trying to claim. On October 16th, the Azov National Guard succeeded again, and it took to Telegram to describe what had happened. Between 5:30 and 8 in the morning, the enemy launched an attack with 22 units of armored vehicles. The largest column, 11 units, tanks and armored combat vehicles, left the area of the settlement of Melanivka at about 7:50, the Azov National Guard reported. The sheer size of this armored battalion shows that Russia was taking the assault on Shakhove seriously. This was no small poke at Ukraine's defenses to see how they would react. Russia would likely have spent several weeks amassing enough tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, or IFVs, to conduct this assault. It was also organized. The mention of the largest column suggests that Russia had split its armor, perhaps with the intent to attack Shakhove from multiple directions. If Russia has been allowed to approach the settlement without any barriers being put in the way, it may well have succeeded in taking Shakhove. The Azov National Guard ended up being the only barrier that Ukraine needed, but it had to overcome a few hurdles before it could properly mount its defense. Russia came prepared, it seems. The country had clearly learned from its tank fiasco just a few days prior. The enemy began preparations for the assault in advance, the Azov National Guard says. In order to complicate the mining of the advance routes, the enemy set up observation posts to detect and destroy drones of the defense forces of Ukraine. This is smart by Russia. One of Ukraine's main defenses in the Pokrovsk region has been to set up drones that patrol roads and any other possible points of incursion that Russia can use to launch its assaults. Russia didn't go into the October 16th assault unprepared. For once, it sent units to figure out where these drones were operating, rather than simply sending soldiers to get destroyed by those drones as a means of conducting reconnaissance. Russia also tried to change how it conducts mechanized assaults. Previously, the Azov National Guard says Russia would launch its mechanized assaults from deep within its own battle formations, which created an obvious problem. Having to travel further means that these assaults were exposed to Ukraine's drones and mines for longer. Time wouldn't be on the Russian forces' side, as Ukraine could use these long journeys to ruin Russia's chances before its assaults even began. This time, Russia planned to use October 15th to slowly advance its mechanized units to the outskirts of Shakhove, using trees and forested areas to provide cover from Ukraine's ever-present drone eyes in the skies. Again, it's a smart strategy, at least when compared to Russia's other assaults. The plan was for Russia to close the distance first, without alerting Ukraine, so that it could then launch its assault immediately rather than having to travel to do so. However, Russia's strategy failed. The Azov National Guard cottoned on to what it was doing in time. The maneuver was unsuccessful. 2 units of armored vehicles were detected by reconnaissance and destroyed by artillery and FPV drones of the unmanned systems forces before they even tried to hide in the forest, the Azov National Guard reports. The FPV drones must have acted as the first wave of Ukraine's defense, as October 16th saw Ukraine go from attacking Russia's incoming units to taking them out altogether. The Azov National Guard says that a combination of effective mining, likely laid on the routes Ukraine predicted Russia would try to take once it had discovered the armor, and advanced engineering equipment placed in the right positions stopped the Russian assault in its tracks. This is where Ukraine's artillery must have come into play. As FPV drones laid waste to Russia's armor directly, Ukraine's artillery fired on the enemy positions to ensure Russia's tanks and IFVs couldn't get anywhere near Shakhove. Russia attempted to use Ukrainian forests to hide its advance. Those same forests ended up serving as Ukraine's trap, and Russia paid a heavy price. By the end of Ukraine's counterattacks, 9 of Russia's tanks and IFVs had been completely destroyed. Another 4 were damaged, and that often means they'll be taken out of commission sooner rather than later. Russia's forces have a long history of abandoning their vehicles at the slightest hint of trouble. They were doing it as early as March 1, 2022, and they've been doing it ever since. It makes more sense to get out of a damaged vehicle and run into cover than it does to stay in that vehicle. Would you rather be in a large and barely mobile target when Ukraine's drones are hunting you down, or would you prefer to attempt an escape on foot while making yourself a much smaller target? That's the choice Russian soldiers face when their armor is damaged. And more often than not, making the choice to run on foot leads to damaged armor being claimed by Ukraine. It wasn't just Shakhove that Russia hoped to take on October 16th either. Another small settlement named Volodymyrivka was also in Russia's sight, with the Azov National Guard's counterattack also being coordinated to ensure the settlement was defended. In fact, it's from the direction of this second settlement that we get our proof of what the Azov National Guard and the Ukrainian units alongside which it is working managed to pull off on October 16th. That proof comes from the Sun's YouTube channel, which has published footage of Ukraine's counterstrike. It says that the 82nd Air Assault Brigade played a big role in both setting and closing the trap on Russia's forces, with most of the footage likely coming from FPV and reconnaissance drones that the brigade brought to the battlefield. The footage shows Russia's tanks and IFVs as they attempt their approaches. Early on, we see the view being captured by one of Ukraine's FPV drones as it shadows a Russian armored vehicle. After a few seconds, that drone veers to the left and attacks, scoring a direct hit on the vehicle's tracks. Much of the footage follows a similar pattern. A drone gets one of Russia's tanks or IFVs in its sights. Within seconds of spotting the threat, the drone speeds up and scores a direct hit. Of course, these FPV drones are launching kamikaze attacks, which means the footage they're capturing cuts out the second they score a hit. Russia might try to use that fact to claim that Ukraine wasn't as effective as it was on October 16th. The Azov National Guard and its compatriots are more than aware of that fact, which is why they had reconnaissance drones circling around Russia's armor to capture more footage of everything that happened. Flaming wreckage is seen on the roads and in the Ukrainian tree lines. The message being sent to Putin is clear. This is what happens to Russian armor in Dobropillia. Send more if you dare. Whether Russia will or not remains to be seen. The odds are that more mechanized assaults are going to come because of how desperate Putin is to capture Pokrovsk. Russia appears to see Dobropillia as its route into that vital city, so what Ukraine achieved on October 16th likely serves as a portent of things to come in the Shakhove and Volodymyrivka directions. Russia has already tried to assault Shakhove twice in a week. It's failed to even get close to the settlement both times. All of this leads us to what this successful Ukrainian strike against Russia's mechanized forces means for the future of the Dobropillia region and the war in general. One thing is for certain, things aren't going well for Russia in the Dobropillia direction. RBC Ukraine makes that clear in its report on Ukraine's October 16th attack by providing more details about another assault Russia launched on October 13th. All told, Russia lost 16 heavy armored vehicles on October 13th, including BMP and MTB-LB armor along with its tanks. Add those to the 9 pieces of armor that Russia lost 3 days later, and you get a very productive week for Ukraine's Dobropillia defenders. They've taken out 25 armored vehicles and tanks in total, which takes a significant bite out of the armor Russia hoped to use to both take Shakhove and launch any future assaults on Dobropillia. In a separate October 13th report, RBC Ukraine reveals that Russia lost 78 soldiers during this assault. We don't know how many of the country's soldiers were killed on October 16th. The Azov National Guard didn't reveal that information, likely because it's still tallying up the numbers to figure out how many Russian troops escaped versus how many died inside their armor. However, the 78 casualties in the October 13th assault are already a heavy toll, and it is indicative of a Dobropillia campaign that is really hurting Russia from a manpower perspective. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke about Russia's lack of success in the Dobropillia direction in a Facebook reel, discussing what has been happening in that direction. In just our Dobropillia counteroffensive operation, Russian overall losses have already exceeded 3,000, most of them irrecoverable, Zelensky says. This was the area where the Russians aimed to achieve one of the major breakthroughs on the front, but our forces are neutralizing them. There are a couple of important points here. First, it's clear that Russia has been pushing to take Dobropillia for a long time before its October 16th failure. Losing 3,000 troops to this relatively small city is already embarrassing enough, especially as Russia hasn't even managed to get close to Dobropillia yet. However, it also shows us just how little regard Putin has for the soldiers that he's sending into these types of assaults. Russia has at least attempted to avoid launching a head-on attack on October 16th, though that failed. In other assaults, its forces have basically launched themselves straight into Ukraine's defenses, making it easy for Ukraine to rack up the Russian casualties. Second, Zelensky mentions that most of the 3,000 casualties were irrecoverable. Ukraine's president is touching on an interesting trend we're now seeing in the Ukraine war. On October 13th, Politico reported that Russia has a terrible ratio of killed to wounded soldiers. Right now, that ratio amounts to 1.3 soldiers wounded for every one that dies in Ukraine. That's a dreadful ratio. In today's wars, a country should see multiple wounded for every death due to the impact of modern medicine and more stringent evacuation protocols. Russia, it seems, is happy to leave its wounded to fend for themselves, and many are dying as a result. When it comes to the 3,000 casualties in Dobropillia, this ratio would mean that well over 1,000 of those casualties are deaths. That's a major problem for Russia. It means that future assaults are either going to be weak due to the scale of the death or delayed while Russia tries to replace its soldiers with reserves. Remember that all of this is just in the Dobropillia direction, and Dobropillia isn't even Putin's main target. Russia is launching so many attempted assaults on the settlements around Dobropillia because it's trying to get closer to Pokrovsk. Of course, this also means that every failure in Dobropillia means that Putin will have to wait longer to capture Pokrovsk, assuming Russia ever captures it at all. Putin will feel that he's waited long enough. In the summer, Russia launched a massive offensive in the Pokrovsk direction that was intended to lead to the fall of the city by August. Putin dedicated 110,000 troops to the cause and embarked on a multi-month series of assaults that did succeed in taking some territory close to Pokrovsk. Ukraine countered and took back many of the most important settlements that Russia had briefly occupied. But the point here is that Russia is no closer to getting its hands on Pokrovsk than it was when it launched the offensive that was supposed to cripple Ukraine's defense of the city by the end of August. And Putin needs Pokrovsk to fall. If it doesn't, Russia will really struggle to claim all of Donetsk. Since the war began, Pokrovsk has been one of Ukraine's most important strongholds on the Donetsk front. It's not just that Pokrovsk is an important city from a size perspective. It's also in the perfect geographic location to serve as a logistical hub that Ukraine can use to supply all of its forces in Donetsk, Euronews reports. Putin wants Pokrovsk to both cut off this major logistical artery and to use Pokrovsk as a hub for his own troops. It also helps that Pokrovsk is only 12.4 miles away from the Donetsk administrative border, which you could think of as the finishing line for Russia's entire Donetsk campaign. If Putin's forces reach that border, Donetsk is essentially under Russian control. Pokrovsk is a major barrier preventing that from happening, and with Russia's forces failing so hard in Dobropillia, it seems unlikely that Russia is going to be taking Pokrovsk anytime soon. Do you remember the 110,000 soldiers Putin has dedicated to Pokrovsk? Failed assaults like the one seen against Dobropillia on October 16th are putting a serious dent in those numbers. On October 16th, David Axe, writing for Euromaidan Press, reported that leaked Russian documents have revealed that Russia is suffering 35,000 casualties per month in 2025. Of course, not all of those casualties are in the Pokrovsk direction. However, Axe says, Russia's determination to take Pokrovsk has led to its losses growing by between 18 and 20%. In other words, Russia's monthly casualty average would be lower than 35,000 were it not for the amount of soldiers that it's feeding into the Pokrovsk meat grinder right now. Speaking about meat assaults, Russia at least attempted to prevent October 16th from being yet another one of them. It failed, but it tried. Other units haven't been so successful, as we discovered on September 22nd. That's when United 24 media reported that Russian troops have been exposing their commanders for throwing them into meat assaults from which there is almost no escape. Those assaults, which are happening daily around Pokrovsk, essentially involve Russian commanders ordering their forces to attack regardless of whether those forces are ready to launch an assault or not. One Russian soldier has even documented the outcome of one of these meat assaults in a Telegram post, where he recorded the bodies of several of his fallen comrades. Ukraine's Air Force commented on the post, stating, "This is yet another example of the Russian command's disregard for the lives of its soldiers. They are promised big contract payments and humane treatment, but instead receive nothing and are immediately sent into battle, without equipment, without support, without assistance, straight into meat assaults." These meat assaults aren't working in Pokrovsk, Dobropillia, or anywhere else in the Donetsk region, and Russia's pace of advance proves it. On October 16th, Newsweek reported that the UK Ministry of Defence has revealed that Russia's pace of advance halved in September when compared to August. That halving follows a 3-month pattern of decreases that started in June, which was the height of Russia's summer offensive. What this means is that Putin is sacrificing more soldiers than at any other point in 2025, and he's gaining less ground in return for that sacrifice. October 16th, though not a meat assault in the truest sense of the word, still stands as a testament to how ineffectual Russia's attacks have become. Ukraine often sees them coming from a mile away, especially when mechanized units are involved, and Russia's soldiers are dying in huge numbers in Dobropillia and elsewhere in Pokrovsk as a result. We mentioned mechanized units just now. Another 9 were taken out of commission, potentially going up to 13 thanks to Ukraine's October 16th trap. Russia won't want to see that because it's already struggling mightily to launch these kinds of assaults after almost 4 years of attritional warfare have burned through its tank and armored vehicle stockpiles. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance reports that Russia has lost 11,261 tanks and 23,384 armored vehicles between the beginning of Putin's invasion and October 16th. That's a total of 34,645 pieces of armor gone, and Russia is running out of mechanized units that it can send to assaults like the one in Dobropillia. These kinds of assaults have to work for Russia. When its tanks and vehicles are being taken out before they even have a chance to attack, it only makes a bad problem worse. As far back as February, the International Institute for Strategic Studies was reporting that Russia was on track to run out of tanks by 2026, per Newsweek. Incidents like the October 16th failure aren't going to help Russia remedy that problem, and we're really starting to see how bad Russia's armor situation is right now. On October 7th, United 24 media reported that satellite analysis of Russian tank storage bases has revealed that Russia has gone from having 7,342 usable tanks in storage to just 92. It has many other tanks, but they are in various states of disrepair, with many only being useful to provide components for other tanks that aren't quite so decrepit. If these sorts of trends continue, 2026 is going to be a rough year for Russia's ground assaults. But even when it has armor to deploy, Ukraine proved on October 16th that it's more than up to the task of handling it. Not that it will have to for much longer. Beyond the issues we've just shared with you, Russia's armor situation has become so desperate that it's deploying rotting Soviet-era tanks and vehicles in Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine obliterated everything else. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the Dobropillia and Pokrovsk situations. And thank you, as always, for watching.